From the Times and the Sunday Times, this is The Story. I'm Manveen Rana. Imagine it's the year 2040. The current generation of weight loss drugs have been around for almost 2 decades, and they've probably been improved and become cheaper. We've now been catapulted into a slim new world.
So in 15 years' time, half the population are taking these weekly weight loss injections or daily pills, and it's having a huge impact on our society. Airline profits are going through the roof because they don't have to spend as much money on fuel. Pubs are closing because no one wants to drink anymore. Restaurants have much smaller menus, a lot more vegetables on the menu. There's a health food shop on every corner. The vaping industry's collapsed. Tobacco companies have gone out of business. GP surgeries are closing because we don't need them anymore. Everyone's looking a lot slimmer, and that has cut the NHS budget by 1/10. But everyone's having to go to the gym to keep that muscle mass up. That's where we are in 2040.
It's an interesting thought experiment, and it could soon become reality. The new class of weight loss drugs like Wegovy and Mounjaro are gaining popularity across the UK, where more than 60% of the population are overweight or obese.
This is Mounjaro. I've tried it, and call me fat and lazy if you like, but the results have been absolutely incredible.
I've gone from a dress size 20 being very tight to a size 10 being quite...
Some doctors are microdosing for less side effects.
In the 3 months since I started taking Mounjaro, I've lost an incredible 45 pounds, which is 3 stone 3 pounds.
Or you can take the pill or the injection and with no added willpower, lose all the weight you want.
But what are the downsides to this slim new world? How does it feel when you're taking these drugs? And how much could they change not only the world of medicine, but every facet of society? The Story today: how weight loss drugs are changing the world.
I'm Ben Spencer. I'm the science editor of the Sunday Times.
Ben, it feels like through my lifetime you could almost measure it in the number of miracle cures for weight loss that have come along.
I've written many of them.
Yeah, I bet you have. So when this latest iteration turned up, what did you think? Here we go again, or is this genuinely miraculous?
It wasn't a single moment where it was like, core blimey, here we go, because this wasn't a weight loss drug. This was a diabetes drug. So the original drug made by Novo Nordisk is called Ozempic, and that was used for type 2 diabetes. They had come up with this treatment called semaglutide, which kind of mimics the hormones that the gut produces when you're full. One of the things that this hormone does is it triggers the pancreas to produce insulin, so it lowers blood sugar, which is obviously very useful if you've got type 2 diabetes. And this was the drug that they created, which they called Ozempic. But what they realized is that one of the side effects of this is it reduced appetite in the brain. It reduces blood sugar, and it also tells you you're full. So what they found is, in their trials, all these people with type 2 diabetes, they were losing a lot of weight. So they then licensed a second drug called Wegovy, used for obesity. It's essentially the same drug, but at a different dose. And there's lots of other companies making this now. So the other big one is Eli Lilly, the biggest drugs company in the world, which is an American company. And they make something called Mounjaro, which is a very similar drug. And there's another 150 drugs being created. Everyone wants a slice of this because it is a huge market. There's billions and billions of pounds to be made.
Because the problem it's potentially fixing is huge.
You're sitting on a gold mine because obesity is one of the biggest problems in modern society. In Britain, 2/3 of adults are overweight. 1/3 of children leave primary school overweight. 1/5 of children arrive at primary school overweight. Something like 9% of the NHS annual budget is spent just on dealing with obesity and its side effects.
And it feels like it's already embedded in popular culture. I mean, it seems to pop up everywhere from South Park to politics.
That's right. So South Park had a whole episode on this recently.
The insurance won't pay for it because they're kind of new drugs, and so the only people that can get them are people who can pay $1,200 a month, and the rest of us get this. What's this? It's a prescription for Lizzo. Rich people get Ozempic, poor people get body positivity.
And Sadiq Khan, the mayor of London, recently kind of used Ozempic as an insult to Robert Jenrick, the Shadow Chancellor, who's famously taken the drugs.
What I find ironic, and it's an example of the chutzpah of Mr. Ozempic, is that he was in government when the government cut more than £1 billion from their police budget.
I mean, those drugs that come along every 20, 30 years that really grab the cultural imagination are ones which aren't seen as medicines, are seen more of lifestyle. So the last big one was Viagra. And this one's kind of talked about in a similar scale.
And you've talked a bit about the health benefits. I mean, just talk us through that, because obviously it starts off trying to solve type 2 diabetes. You realise it can also help with people being overweight. What else is it now being touted for?
Just by the very fact of helping people lose weight has a lot of other impacts. You start to see impacts on heart disease, which is tied to obesity. You start to see impacts on various types of cancer, like breast cancer, bowel cancer, which are tied to obesity. But there's something else going on. There's an anti-inflammatory impact, which independently of the weight loss is also impacting heart disease, type 2 diabetes separately, cancer separately. There was a trial published a couple of months ago which found that people who took these drugs started to see lower rates of depression, anxiety, and other mental health problems. And that's thought to be the anti-inflammatory effect in the brain.
Wow.
So completely separate mechanism from the weight loss. The scientists are adamant that this is not just a secondary impact of losing weight, that there is something else going on here. And there's other things. So there's been trials to show that it can impact addiction. One of the reasons it is so effective for weight loss is it stops you craving food. And what scientists have found is it gets rid of other cravings as well. So people don't want to drink alcohol as much. It's very effective at helping stop people smoke.
Even though those aren't related to the process in your gut that is making you feel full.
Exactly. And
That's
here's, alcohol and smoking, I kind of get it a little bit. It's a consumption thing. The one that really made me wake up and think, wow, is it's been found to be effective for gambling addiction.
Gambling addiction?
Which is, to me, is a completely different category of addiction. There's something going on which scientists don't yet understand about the way your brain urges you to do things which aren't good for you. Something about these drugs stop that, which is incredibly powerful.
Ben, obviously, as you say, a lot of this stuff is still being tested. There are a lot of people already taking these drugs. Just talk us through some of the impacts we're seeing. How is it already affecting the way we live?
So the big one really, which really got a lot of headlines and drove home the impact of this, was Weight Watchers filed for bankruptcy earlier this year in the US.
Wow.
Now, Weight Watchers essentially helps people lose weight through strength of will. And
suddenly that's not necessary.
Suddenly it's not necessary. In the US, they lost, I think, something like 1/3 of their customers last year. In America, 1 in 8 adults have now taken one of these drugs, according to polling. Now, we're not seeing that in the UK yet. About 500,000 people have so far taken these drugs in the UK, but we're already seeing huge effects. So Holland and Barrett have seen a surge in health food sales, which they say is down to the new drugs, because they say their customers would rather eat healthy foods. There's hope also that other industries will benefit. So the airline industry spends millions and millions of pounds on fuel, which have obvious impacts on climate change. And there's projections that their fuel intake will come down if people start losing weight. On the flip side, Walmart, which is the biggest retail company in the world, has already said that it's starting to see each basket of food lower calories and a potentially lower value. Companies are worried that alcohol sales are going to collapse. So one of the big investment funds called Fundsmith Equity in January sold its stocks in Diageo, which is one of the big alcohol companies, saying that weight loss drugs would dampen alcohol sales, so it didn't want to invest anymore.
Makes sense. What impact could all of this have on the UK economy? You know, as you say, it hasn't completely hit here yet. We haven't seen as much of it. But if you were to project how it might affect us over the next decade or so, and what can we expect?
So there was a study published earlier this year which found a £4.5 billion impact, beneficial impact on the UK economy just through reduction in sick days, and only for obesity and type 2 diabetes. The Oxford economist Daniel Susskind, who's written quite extensively about these drugs, he told me that we are only in the foothills of understanding what these drugs might mean for the economy. And he goes on to say, in the 21st century, the economic consequences of weight loss drugs might turn out to be similar in scale to what the discovery of penicillin did to the 20th century. So that's huge. I mean, he's comparing these to the discovery of antibiotics. The Health Secretary, Wes Streeting, talks about this a lot. Because the NHS is in crisis, people within the Department of Health and the NHS are kind of pulling their hair out, trying to work out what to do. This is potentially one of those few drugs which can reduce that overall burden of ill health. But these are not cheap drugs. Privately, you're talking £200 a month. NHS gets a discount on that, but it's still a big outlay, which is why they're not prescribing it to 3.4 million adults, just because it will cost so much. So over about the next decade or so, they will increase the number of people they prescribe them to.
Ben, you've talked us through the upsides, which potentially are enormous. There must be some downsides too, though.
If this is a problem created by big food, should we really be empowering big pharma to solve it, giving them billions and billions of pounds to solve it? That's one argument. The other argument is a lot of GPs, who are the gatekeepers to the NHS, are quite uncomfortable with using these drugs. And they say we should diet first, we should do more exercise, basically prevention over prescribing. As with all drugs, there are short-term side effects. So people describe nausea, diarrhea. There's occasional reports of depression and anxiety. There's also, we don't know what the long-term impacts are because people haven't taken these for very long. So we don't know what happens after 5 years, after 10 years.
Yeah.
There's evidence that people tend to lose muscle mass. So there's issues with frailty. And then there's more subjective side effects. So someone I spoke to basically said it changed her personality. So much of our society revolves around food, socialising in a pub.
Yeah.
So if you lose that, what does it do to your identity? What does it do to your social circle? You know, and this can sound like trivial, but if you don't want to cook your children a meal, and that's the main time that you interact with your children and download what's happened in the day, then that can potentially change your relationship. So there's all kinds of things, potential impacts that we haven't thought about, which are just becoming apparent as more and more people start to take these.
And what happens when people stop taking the drugs? Do they keep the weight off?
There was a trial published this year that found, on average, people put on all the weight they had lost within 10 months of stop taking them. So there's basically no exit plan.
Right. You'd be on them for life.
You would be on them for life, potentially, unless there's an argument that you could use these drugs to break a habit.
It's a bit of a shock therapy that breaks the cycle.
Yeah. But the trials so far have shown that doesn't happen. When people stop taking them, the appetite returns and then some. One person who I spoke to described it as just being ravenous after stopping the drugs.
Harriet, would you mind just introducing yourself for our listeners?
I'm Harriet Walker. I'm the fashion editor at The Times.
And given the pressure in that world to be skinny, are you seeing Ozempic all around?
I think it's everywhere. I think you see it beyond fashion as well. I think you can see it in how celebrities have changed over the past few years too. But you will see people at Fashion Week sort of twice a year. So within 6 months, they might have dropped a dress size or so. Obviously, that could be from a diet, but increasingly it probably isn't. There's a phrase at Fashion Week which is on the pen, and the pen refers to the way that you take the drugs. So in this sort of injectable self-dosing, looks like a pen. Like a biro.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. So someone will turn up and someone else might mutter, on the pen.
Wow.
But I've been at 40th birthday parties that very much aren't Fashion Week, and you see the same thing. You see it at the school gates. You see it in the office. Someone a friend works with came in after a summer holiday 3 weeks away, literally half the size they had been.
I mean, how common is it? And are people taking it even if you wouldn't have thought of them as particularly overweight?
It's fairly common. I've heard of lots of people who are lying to get it, obviously, because there's a BMI issue to NHS prescriptions. I know people who work at brands who have an art department who've asked them to Photoshop the holiday pictures.
To make them look bigger?
In order to qualify. I know people who have just Googled obese stomach and sent in a sort of picture from the internet.
Wow.
It's fairly common practice. I realise, it can sound shocking, but it's so everywhere. Obviously, I work in fashion, but teachers, doctors, civil servants, solicitors, policemen.
And a lot of this does trickle down from fashion. People see the fashion world and it inspires what they think they should be aiming for.
I don't know that it does anymore. I think there was a time when people paid attention to what was happening on catwalks, but I think the dominant imagery now is from Hollywood, and I think it's also from social media. There's such a big movement now on Instagram and on TikTok as well. There's a thing called Skinny Talk, which is basically a whole channel devoted to eating as little as you possibly can.
Skinny people have a different mindset, part 5.
Skinny Talk es una de las cosas que me ha ayudado un millón en este mes y medio.
You want to lose weight? This is the schedule you need to get skinny this summer.
There was this kind of a seam of internet culture when I was a teenager, which was called pro-anorexic. And there seems to be a resurgence of that. Skinny chat is dominating culture again.
So all of the, that brief window we had on body positivity and people being comfortable in their own skin, that's gone.
I don't think it has gone entirely from real life. I think a lot of the body positivity things that we saw on Instagram, it sort of fell into two extremes, didn't it? You have very, very skinny celebrities, and then you had a sort of body positivity conversation that also foregrounded very, very large bodies. And actually, for most people, day to day, they're neither of those things, but they are probably all on a diet.
And you actually decided to join the fray, effectively, and try Ozempic. What made you take that decision?
Since the pandemic, coming back into working in fashion and journalism and sort of celebrity culture as well, I'd seen firsthand lots of people who had taken it, and it did sort of freak me out. At the beginning, I thought, I don't need that. And then gradually I heard people were doing this thing called microdosing. So you take the lowest effective dose. In this country, there's a kind of starter dose. So I heard about people sort of doing this for a couple of months, losing a bit of weight and then coming off it and having rewired their natural appetite. And I suppose I feel like I've been on a diet since I was about 12. I've tried everything, I've been paleo, I've been vegan. I was eating very, very healthily, high protein, low carb, fruit and vegetables and whole grains. And then it would get to about 8 o'clock and I'd think, oh, I'm just so tired. My children are in bed. And I'd end up having a couple of beers and some Percy Pigs and maybe a whole bag of Percy Pigs. I've never had an eating disorder. It's not that. I have been constantly aware of what I'm eating and how that will affect how I look. And I think that's fairly common among most women and increasingly most men. And I guess I got to a point where I thought, well, what about if I didn't have to think about food all day? What if there is an opportunity to actually rewire how I think about food entirely?
I should say, as somebody who's seen you around the office for years, you're not in any way overweight. You say your clothes weren't fitting, nobody would know it.
No, of course. But all of this stuff is relative, isn't it? And it's all very personal. No, I was aware that I wasn't overweight. I'm aware that there are people who will think this is pure vanity, and I'm sure in many ways it is. But I didn't feel good in my body. I had really sore joints after both pregnancies, so I tried to get back into running and I couldn't. And I was just so tired of what the internet is now calling food noise.
Never quite feeling satisfied.
Yes, exactly. And obviously that's what Ozempic is for, that feeling of satiety.
Did you have a specific aim?
I'd been trying for about 5 years, so after the birth of my second child, to just lose about half a stone, because then I knew that my jeans would fasten again.
How did you get hold of it? And is it expensive?
It is expensive. It cost £250 a month, which felt like a lot. But then I also thought of all of the various gym memberships I've had over the years, which have languished. So I thought, what the hell, I'm going to do it. And how did I get hold of it? Completely legally, I should say. I don't have a BMI over, I think the NHS requires a BMI over 27. I don't have that, but private prescribers, such as the one I used, have slightly more leeway with how they can prescribe these drugs. So I was prescribed it for food noise, which is quite an internet-y phrase, but it's, I think everyone can understand what that is. It's that sort of constant reaching for a biscuit.
You decide to try microdosing. How do you go about that? Because, I assume it turns up in an injection. How do you only take a small dose of it?
Because in the UK, you can only get these drugs in these sort of pre-formatted doses within pens. The lowest dose you can take is the starter dose, which for me was 2.5 milligrams. But there is a movement in the States where you can alter the levels, alter the dose a bit more to take much less than that. Not particularly for weight loss, but for everything else that these drugs can do. So to help with joint pain and inflammation and autoimmune issues. So that's proper microdosing. What I was doing is what my doctor called lowest effective dose. You start on that. And if you need to titrate upwards and take a bit more after the first month is over, you can, but you don't need to. Whereas the way these drugs are prescribed for people who are overweight and obese is that you sort of methodically go up in dose every month because otherwise your appetite comes back. You inject once a week. Technically it lasts for 5 days. So you sort of feel a bit more hungry in the final 2 days, but you're certainly not back up to normal appetite by any means.
Yeah.
But yeah, I took a starter dose every week for 6 weeks.
And what happened?
I injected it, and then straight afterwards, I had a real panic that I wasn't going to eat enough. So I had 3 slices of toast.
Not the most effective.
Well, it was sourdough. Yeah, so I had 3 slices of toast and still felt completely normal. And then I think my husband came back from work quite late. And by the time he got home, I sort of still wasn't hungry enough to have dinner. I remember that night feeling quite nauseous, not terribly, but a bit, and I just went to bed. And when I woke up the next morning, the nausea had gone. I felt completely normal. I had a small, quite healthy breakfast, and it sort of went on from there. I think that first weekend I had a friend's birthday party, and possibly for the first time ever, it just did not feel like drinking. It was really? Yeah, it was really interesting.
So it does impact your desire for alcohol as well as for food.
So I was in a pub, and my husband said, he asked me what I wanted, and I just asked him for some water, and his face was just, he was just like, "Who are you?" So I had a night in the pub and I think I had half a pint for a whole evening.
So how quickly did you feel the results? I mean, were you losing weight?
I remember waking up maybe 2 or 3 days in and looking in the mirror in the bathroom and seeing my cheekbones for the first time in what felt like a few years. I had been on it a week, I think. Maybe I'd done a second injection and I had lost the half stone that I had intended to lose.
In a week?
In a week.
That's extraordinary.
It was astonishing. But I felt good. I was eating. I was doing lots of weights. You've got to do loads of weights to, like, resistance training when you're doing it, because otherwise you lose muscle instead of fat. I had quite a lot of energy. I didn't feel sick again. There are all sorts of side effects that I think being on a higher dose can bring. But beyond nausea that first night, I didn't have anything unpleasant to deal with.
You mentioned mood, so clearly, like, the cravings, the food noise is gone. How does it affecting your mood though? Because one of the impacts is that normally a treat, whether it's a packet of Percy Pigs or a drink when you get to the pub and it's a friend's, it's a big gathering, it is going to give you a bit of a lift. Do you just not get lifts anymore? I mean, what happened?
It's not that you're completely numb. Remember, I was only on it for 6 weeks.
Yeah.
I know people who've been on it for much longer and they do get slightly apathetic. What I found towards the end of those 6 weeks was that on the mornings that I didn't have to be anywhere, I had that sort of little voice in my head saying, well, maybe I'll just stay in bed today. And I've never had that.
Yeah.
But it wasn't a sort of depressive thing. It was just a sort of couldn't be bothered.
Apathetically?
Yeah, it was, yeah. But that was towards the end of the 6 weeks. I didn't have that at the beginning.
And in the first week, you'd lost half a stone. What's happening in the second and third week? Are you still losing weight, or is this about just maintaining?
Certainly the first week was the most dramatic, and then it sort of plateaued a little bit, but it was mainly getting used to what was the right amount of food to eat on that dose. And I think with hindsight, it was also getting used to kind of new habits around not snacking when I wasn't hungry. Because when you're on these drugs, you notice that you're suddenly reaching for a snack and you think, well, why am I doing that? Because I'm actually not hungry. I found that I was reaching for these things when I was stressed, sad, lonely, angry, tired. Or even another thing I noticed was simply that if I'd been outside, I just like to sit down and have a snack. And I found that kind of fascinating.
Yeah, it does make you look at your habits, I suppose.
Yes, totally. Now that I'm not on it, I see it as a kind of circuit breaker for processed food that I think is addictive.
For you, at the end of that 6 weeks, I mean, firstly, how much weight had you lost altogether? But also, having had the circuit breaker, what happens when you stop taking it?
After 6 weeks, I had lost a stone in total. But I'd had sciatica since my second pregnancy 5 years ago, and that had gone. I've always had quite bad eczema. That had improved massively. I think possibly just because of being off sugar. So coming off after 6 weeks, what did I notice? Obviously, I had that panic of, and now I have to do a really good job and keep all of this back, on track.
Yeah.
But actually, it was not hard. I think before I was in a cycle of eating rigidly healthily and saying that some things were forbidden. And by the time I came off these drugs, I had a mindset that was, nothing is forbidden. You can have whatever you want, just stop when you're full. And it sort of worked. I don't really want to eat the things that I used to want to eat because I know that I won't feel great afterwards.
Yeah.
I don't really have cravings anymore.
Yeah.
It's such a relief.
And has it worked? I mean, have you kept the weight off?
Yeah, it's 6 months since I stopped the 6 weeks worth of injections, and I'm the same weight. I've got much more energy. I can run again, and my body feels in better shape than it has done for decades, since before I had children even.
It's clearly worked. You did it for 6 weeks. That was enough to just act as a circuit breaker, to change habits, to make you feel much healthier. And yet you were quite conflicted about taking it.
Yes, of course. I think any woman knows the sort of cultural expectations to be thin and to regulate your appetite and to look a certain way. And I hate that. I have a daughter. I'm very, very careful around her and my son as well about how we talk about food. So I felt like an enormous hypocrite taking this. It's how I used to feel about kind of tweakments and plastic surgery, which is that it's good for the individual but not the collective. And yet I did it because I had reached a point where I just didn't know what else to do.
And I mean, for you, you talked about one of the things you wanted to cure was food noise. Do you think there was something about the culture you grew up in that sort of almost kind of twisted that natural mindset?
Oh, totally. I grew up in the noughties. That was, you know, the era of magazines that sort of did red rings around celebrity cellulite, or magazines called Kate Winslet chubby back then. She was a size 10.
Yeah.
And it has stayed with me. And here was a way to undo it. So I did feel like a hypocrite. I did feel guilty. But actually, I now feel like I'm in a much more natural state of mind around food, not restrictive, no guilt, no cravings. It's a real relief.
Ben, assuming we don't find out about any terrible negative impacts and we keep going with the sense that this is a drug that could solve many, many of society's problems, can you see us in the future, you know, a decade or two down the line, basically eliminating obesity in the way that we did with, say, smallpox?
I don't think we'll eliminate obesity because not everyone tolerates these drugs. Not everyone likes taking drugs. And certainly not everyone wants to inject themselves once a week. That might change when the pills come in. So a number of companies are developing pill forms of these drugs. And the first of those is probably going to arrive some point in 2026. So that might up the number of people who take them. They will definitely become cheaper. The key thing will be when they come off patent. The first drug to come off patent will be in about 2033. And that's when we might begin to see a huge uptick in the number of people taking them. And that's when you get to see real breakthrough, real numbers. And that's when you might to see a huge impact on the number of people who have obesity.
And along with this increase in uptake, could we see more unknown negative side effects, things that we'll only find out when people have been taking them for a long time?
We could potentially have a whole swathe of unforeseen long-term consequences. So people live longer, the dementia burden will rise, frailty could arise. So we could have, you know, a lot of elderly people with far higher incidence of dementia, all in wheelchairs because they've lost all their muscle through 30, 40 years of taking these drugs. I don't know. No one knows. But the fact is, if we have a lot of people taking these, there will be impact. It could completely change the way our NHS works, the way our economy works, the way our society works.
That was Ben Spencer, science editor at the Sunday Times, and Harriet Walker, fashion editor at the Times. The producer today was Olivia Case. The executive producer was Molly Guinness, and sound design and theme composition were by Mal Lassetto. If you can, do leave us a review wherever you get your podcasts. Thanks for listening. See you again soon.